the real reason why people buy into the story, even if it is utterly absurd, is not because they believe in the narrative. It is because the narrative leads to the new social bond. That's the real reason.
Welcome everyone to this show. I am your host, Dr. Chris Martenson, and today's show is going to be one of the most important you'll watch this year. I've spent pretty much the past 2 years covering the science of COVID. Well, today we're going to cover the psychology of COVID. More specifically, the ways in which many societies and cultures around the world, principally countries holding Western values, I've noticed, have overreacted, have underreacted, and have sometimes even dangerously fallen into what might be called mass psychosis, or more accurately, mass formation. During such moments, mental health declines. Societies can do great harm to themselves and to others as they irrationally overreact to perceived and sometimes entirely imaginary threats. Today's guest is Professor Matthias Desmet of Ghent University, who is one of the leading expert voices on this specific topic. In addition to being a lecturing professor in clinical psychology at Ghent University, he holds a master's degree in statistics. Professor Desmet, I know you're a busy man these days. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and welcome to the show.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it really is an honor to have you here, and I want to get right into it. So the psychology of COVID. Let's talk, if we could, from your own perspective. What was your history with COVID? It erupted around the world in January of 2020. How long was it before you became concerned maybe that we weren't really following the science?
Yeah, well, at the end of February 2020, I wrote my first opinion paper in which I warned, here in Belgium, it was an opinion paper written in Dutch, in which I warned that the anxiety for the virus could be more dangerous than the virus itself. That was the title of the opinion paper. And it shows, I think it's good to be entirely honest and open to you. I from the beginning, I took a critical perspective. So from the beginning, I had the feeling, I studied the figures and the statistics, and I noticed immediately, or at least I had the impression immediately, that the dangerousness of the virus was overestimated. When I studied the mortality rates, the infection fatality rate, the case fatality rate, also the models of issued by Imperial College in London, which were the basis of the corona measures worldwide, I think, or at least in Europe and in the States. When I studied all these figures, graphs, statistics, and the mathematical models, I immediately had the impression that the dangerousness of the virus was overestimated. And in my opinion, by the end of May 2020, this was proven beyond doubt. For instance, the mathematical models of Imperial College predicted that in a country such as Sweden, about 80,000 people would die. And Sweden, of course, is a very interesting case because it was exceptional in its in the corona measures it took, because it didn't go with the lockdown strategy and stuff. So, but by the end of May, according to the models, by the end of May 2020, at least 80,000 people should have died in Sweden. And by the end of May 2020, only 6,000 people died of COVID in Sweden. And these 6,000, that figure of 6,000 was even reached with a very enthusiastic counting methods that were used in the COVID crisis. I often use that word enthusiastic because indeed, when the people dying from the flu are counted, usually they are counted in a much more conservative way. But anyway, by the end of May 2020, I had the feeling that for me, it was proven beyond doubt if we looked at figures in the stats and the models in this crisis, that the dangerousness had been dramatically overestimated of the virus. And I noticed quite some other things as well. For instance, that at the moment, it became clear that the initial mathematical models overrated the mortality rate of the virus, or the mortality of the virus. At the moment it became clear, one would expect that a narrative, a corona narrative, that is based and that claims to have a scientific basis, or to be based on scientific models, you would expect that at the moment it becomes clear that the models were wrong, that at that moment the narrative and all the measures, the strategy that is based on the narrative would be corrected, of course. But that didn't happen. The narrative continued as if the models were right. And the corona measures, the reaction to the coronavirus, remained by and large the same around the world. So that was one thing that was very striking to me at that moment. And also, even more important, I think, I noticed that in one way or another, all the attention of the population, of the entire society, was really focused on one point in the world, on the danger of the coronavirus, on the casualties, which the victims that could be claimed by the coronavirus. And it seemed as if all the rest did not exist anymore. For instance, from the beginning of the crisis, the United Nations and several other large international institutions warned us that the number of people starving or dying from hunger in developing countries as a consequence of the lockdown strategies could be far higher, and might probably be far higher than the number of people, than the number of victims the virus could claim, even if no measures were taken at all. So, on the one hand, we have the dangerousness of the virus. On the other hand, we have the collateral damage that can be caused by the corona strategy. And it seemed as if nobody really succeeded, or in general, the population and the governments and stuff did not manage to take both sources of danger into account. At any time, we've seen in the mainstream media really a comparison of the number of people that could die from the virus and the number of people that could die from the corona measures. So, and that actually in itself is the most basic thing a society should consider. Mm-hmm. If you think about remedies for a disease, then the first thing you think about, or you try to know, is whether the remedy will not be worse than a disease. And that didn't happen. So in one way or another, it seemed that people were so focused, the attention of people was so focused and so limited to one specific limited aspect of reality, that they didn't see the other aspects of reality anymore. And that was the moment around May 2020, I really started to shift the perspective and to think. In the beginning of the crisis, I think that I took in the first place took a statistical perspective. I started to study the numbers, to study the graphs, and so on. And then from May 2020 onwards, I had a feeling that the core of the problem was not situated at the level of was not a biological problem, but that it was a psychological problem. And from then on, I started to think about how I could understand what was happening in society. How was it possible that a society went through a process like this, or didn't see anymore that in many respects, the way we behaved was absurd and counterproductive. And it took me a few months before I could really, in my opinion, hit the nail and started to understand that what was happening in society was a large-scale process of crowd formation or mass formation, as we sometimes call it in psychology or in social psychology. When I think about it now, it seems strange to me that it took me so long, because I had been lecturing on this process for quite some years before, and it shows me, I think, how difficult it is. If an entire population or an entire society is grasped in a certain strong psychological process, how difficult it is as an individual to step back and to look from a distance and to understand what is happening. So, but around in August 2020, I wrote an opinion paper on mass formation, and that was the moment when I really started to understand what was happening at a psychological level, I think. Maybe it would be good if I describe this process of mass formation a little bit.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that. What is it? How's it get started?
Yes, it's something that emerges in a society when very specific conditions are met. For instance, the first and most crucial condition is that there should be a lot of people who experience a lack of social bond. So that's the most important thing.
And what do you mean by lack of social bonds?
Lack of social bond. People should experience a lack of connectedness with other people. A lack of connectedness with other people.
But could you theoretically feel a lack of connectedness even though you're surrounded by people?
Oh yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes,
so this isn't just physical isolation, like in a
no, not at all.
Okay.
No. So that means that people feel lonely and isolated in one way or another, not able to connect emotionally to other people. That's essentially what I mean with the lack of social bond. And it was huge in the years before the Corona crisis. For instance, in the UK, a minister was appointed, a loneliness minister, just to focus on the problem of loneliness in society. And if also in the States, the government mentioned that there was a loneliness epidemic. More than 50% of the people mentioned that they had no meaningful relationships at all in their life. That they only were connected, for instance, through the internet or in the online world. That only in the virtual space they dared to talk about their emotions and their problems, for instance. So there was really, the loneliness was huge, and that it had been increasing throughout the last decennia constantly. So on the one hand, we have this most crucial condition is the lack of social bond. And then a second one is also important, a lack of meaning making. The second one, the lack of meaning making, actually follows from the first one. If people feel disconnected, if people don't have meaningful relationships, if they are not embedded in a social network, then they typically will experience their life and their jobs and stuff as meaningless. That's something very typical, because human beings or social beings, when they lack social bond, they will also lack a feeling of or an experience of meaning and sense in life. And for instance, also that can be very well illustrated through academic research. For instance, David Graeber wrote a book, Bullshit Jobs, in which he describes that 40% of the population had the experience in 2017, I think. 40% of the people experienced their job as completely meaningless. And an additional about 20%, I think, experienced a strong lack of meaning. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Gallup World Poll, which found that worldwide, only 13% of the people reported that they considered the job to be meaningful. Only 30%. And 63% said that they experienced their job as meaningless, that they sleepwalked through the office the entire day. So stuff like that. It shows that there was a radical lack of meaning making, for instance, at the level of people's jobs. So the third
the sense making, though, if we could, this matters to me a lot as somebody who considers himself rational and a scientist and all this other stuff. I've noticed that even prior to COVID, we were having difficulty with sense making. So,
of course,
quick example. Environmental groups say we just have to decarbonize 50% by 2030. But if, as a scientist who studies energy, if you just run the math, the next question is, well, which half the population is going to die and which 70% of the jobs should go away? And there's no connection between those things, but it's pushed as an idea that's really important, but it doesn't ground. Is that where we lose our sense when we have these narratives that fundamentally you can't even scratch at them with your fingernail without ruining them?
Yes, there are many reasons why we experience this lack of sense making now. This lack of sense making has become stronger throughout the last 2 centuries, actually. At this moment, I just finished a manuscript of a book in which I, in the first 5 chapters, describe the psychological evolutions throughout the last two centuries. And they all, like throughout the last 2 centuries, the phenomenon of mass formation became increasingly strong. And it was exactly because people experienced less and less social connectedness and less sense-making or meaning-making in life. That were two central conditions. So it's quite complicated. It's associated, I think, to the mechanistic view on man and the world, which became more and more predominant throughout the last 2 centuries. Yes, but actually, I'm talking now about the situation, the psychological condition of the population before the corona crisis, because you need these conditions in order for large-scale mass formation to emerge in a society. So we had this lack of social connectedness, this lack of meaning-making, and the third condition is very important as well, is that there have to be high levels of free-floating anxiety in the population, free-floating anxiety and free-floating psychological discontent. And what do I mean with free-floating anxiety? Free-floating anxiety is a kind of anxiety that is not connected to a mental representation, which is extremely important. Sometimes when we feel anxious, we know what we feel anxious for. When we see a lion, a dog, or something dangerous, and we are scared, then we know what we are anxious for. That means that the anxiety is connected to a mental representation. And that means that we can mentally control the anxiety because we know what we are scared of. If we run away, we have from the lion, from the dog, and so on, we have a certain feeling of being in control of our anxiety. We know what we can do to avoid the object of anxiety. But sometimes people are confronted with a kind of anxiety that is not connected to a mental representation. And that is the most aversive mental state, because it puts people in a situation where they feel entirely helpless, because they don't know what they can run away of. And so that's extremely important. Yes.
Do we know, Professor, that state? I'm familiar, and I've gotten my audience familiarized with the idea of the triune brain that we have. These evolutionarily, we had a core brain, right? So-called the reptilian brain, on top of which another structure got slapped, on top of which finally our higher cortical thing got slapped. And it's rather like starting with the DOS operating system and ending up with Windows. It's a poor sort of a match from time to time. Where does this free-floating anxiety reside? Is this one of our more archaic sort of, is this down in our emotional centers, meaning it's somehow less subject or available to our cortical or rational centers? Where does it live in our brains?
I don't think it's something primitive. I think it's something very typical for the human being in this respect, that for human beings, it's much more difficult than for animals to make sense of their world, because their psychological system works through language. People use language to understand their world, and language is a system that never ends or that never leads to clear-cut interpretations of the world, and that's something typical for human beings. I think it's much more connected to our mental system, to the typically human mental system, than through certain archaic or old primitive reactions. But in any case, it was very clear that just before the corona crisis, the levels of free-floating anxiety were extremely high. And for instance, 1 out of 5 was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder before the crisis.
1 out of 5.
1 out of 5. So that's huge. And of course, 20% of the people received the diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, but much more people were confronted with anxiety. And even much more were confronted with psychological discontent in general. Because if you look in a country such as Belgium, for instance, which has a population of 11 million people, each year, 300 million doses of antidepressants are used. Each year, 300 million doses, and only antidepressants. We are not talking about antipsychotics and all kinds of other psychopharmaceuticals. But that's huge. So you see that also that was steeply increasing throughout the last decennia. So the third condition was definitely met in our society.
And maybe you could answer this, because this has been a huge focus of mine. When I was wondering about where the onset of depression, what was called depression, was usually mid-40s. That was the average, but that bell curve is like 4 standard deviations, and it's all the way down in the low 20s now.
No. Mm-hmm.
And then psychologists started to realize, it's not actually depression, because that's either situational or chemical. It's amenable to treatment, compared to this new thing, which wasn't amenable to treatment. So they started calling it demoralization. And what caught me was that was defined as a loss of connection between your cognitive map and the world you are actually living in. They weren't connecting anymore, right?
Yes. That's something that typically leads to this free-floating effects, such as free-floating anxiety, frustration, and so on. Yes, typically. It's this disconnection indeed between the cognitive mapping of the world and the world itself, you could say, between the symbolic and the real.
Yes. Yeah, so that's already epidemic even before COVID comes along. And what's the fourth condition?
The fourth condition is that there has to be a lot of free-floating aggression and frustration. And that follows from the first three conditions. If people feel socially disconnected and they feel that their life makes no sense or has no meaning, and they are confronted with a lot of free-floating anxiety and psychological discontent that is hard to control mentally, then they will typically feel frustrated and aggressive. And all this free-floating frustration and aggression will also be without object. People will not know why they feel aggressive, but they will feel it, or they will feel frustrated. And in this condition, something very typical happens. People start to look for an object of, or for a mental representation to which they can connect their anxiety and their frustration. So, and then, if under these conditions, a narrative is distributed in society through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time, providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, something very specific happens, something very important. All this free-floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety indicated in the narrative, and people might be extremely willing to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, which is indicated in the narrative. And in that way, that's the first stage. That has a specific psychological advantage. All this free-floating anxiety is now connected to a mental representation. So, which means that people experience more psychological control in the situation. And then the next step is taken. Something happens at another level. Meaning, because many people participate in the same strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, a new kind of social bond emerges, a new kind of solidarity. So people feel connected again in a new way. And that's the most crucial thing. If you look at the Corona crisis and you listen at the you listen to the mainstream narrative, then you will hear that everything is about solidarity. You have to participate. You have to accept the vaccine. You have to respect social distancing, because if you don't, you lack citizenship. You show no solidarity. So that's the most crucial thing always in mass formation. So that's the real reason why people buy into the story, even if it is utterly absurd, is not because they believe in the narrative. It is because the narrative leads to the new social bond. That's the real reason. And then there is a fourth advantage. All the frustration and aggression can be directed at an object. And that object is the people who, for one reason or another, do not want to participate in the mass formation. That's typically, historically, time and time again, we see the same process. When a population, for instance, the really large-scale mass formations as they happened during the French Revolution, which were not very large, but they were large. The large-scale mass formations, which led to the emergence of communism and Stalinism in the Soviet Union. The large-scale mass formations, which led to Nazi Germany, to the emergence of the totalitarian state in Nazi Germany, they all shared the same characteristics. The population was exactly these four conditions were fulfilled, and then a new kind of solidarity emerged. And all the frustration and aggression was channeled by directing it at the people who did not want to participate or who couldn't participate in the mass formation. So, and then you have this very strange situation where people start from a very negative and aversive mental state, lack of social bond, lack of meaning making, free-floating anxiety, and a lot of frustration and aggression. They switch from this very highly aversive mental state to a symptomatic positive state, where they feel connected, their life makes sense because they are all, life start to make sense again through this heroic struggle with the object of anxiety. People are united in their struggle against the coronavirus, for instance. Mm-hmm. So, and their anxiety is connected to a mental representation, and they can satisfy their frustration and aggression. So that switch from a highly negative mental state to a positive mental state brings people in a kind of mental intoxication. That's why people continue to believe in the narrative, even if it is utterly absurd. And you know, the measures, the corona measures, for instance, like the social distancing, the mask wearing, the vaccination strategies, they function for a certain part of the population. And I'm talking probably about 30% of the population. It's not much more than that. Only 30% of the population usually is really into this process of mass formation, into this process of a collective hypnosis. Then there are an additional 40 or 50% who just go along with the masses, who will never go against the current, because in one way or another, they think it's better not to do so. And then there is an additional 20%, sometimes 10%, it depends a little bit, who really is not hypnotized at all, and who also wants to speak out and do something to change the situation. But the first part of the population, the 30% who are really into the process of mass formation, for these people, the more absurd the measures are, the better they will work, the measures, and the more they will be inclined to buy into the narrative. That because the measures
is this function, the bigger the lie, the better. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, here? Indeed, yes. But the measures really function as a ritual, and the rituals are a kind of behavior that has to be without pragmatic meaning, and that has to demand a sacrifice of the individual. By participating in a ritual, an individual shows that the collective is more important than the individual, meaning that rituals have to be a kind of behavior that is without pragmatic meaning, that has no advantages for people, no pragmatic advantages, and that for which people has to sacrifice something. So that's a strange thing, that for a certain part of the population, it really doesn't make a difference whether the measures are absurd or not. And that's what's so strange for the people who are not in the process of mass formation, because they look and they see what's happening here. Do the people not see that what's going on is utterly absurd, and that it's even dangerous? But no, they won't. Because
it's brilliant. This cuts right to the core of like, this is how profound it is for me. So children, not at all really statistically, just not even touched by COVID, except for very few have some comorbidities. Actually, the science says they don't really transmit COVID all that well either, because they have such high innate immunity to this thing. And yet there are people out there saying we need our children to be masked, even though there's no science to support the idea that the mask does anything, except it probably harms the child's cognitive and social development skills at a critical period of time. So people are willing ritualistically to sacrifice their children.
Indeed.
That's powerful to me. Is that what we're talking about?
That's what we are talking about. Yes. That's exactly what we are talking about. And that's like, yes. So this process of mass formation has some symptomatic advantages, but it has huge disadvantages as well. And one of them is, the first is that the field of attention really gets very narrow. People only see what the narrative indicates. And that's something typical for hypnosis as well. When someone is hypnotized, he will only be aware of the part of reality the hypnotist focuses on. And that's exactly the same in mass formation. So in mass formation, people are only aware of the part of reality, both cognitively and emotionally, that is indicated by the hypnotizing or by the mass narrative. And that's the reason why people don't seem to be aware of the collateral damage of the measures. And in one way or another, people know somewhere that there is collateral damage of measures, but it has no cognitive and emotional impact. That's the problem. It's not, It's not, there is no psychological energy attached to these mental representations. And that's why they have no impact at all.
So
People
an example might be, it's incredibly awful, worst thing ever that a 78-year-old obese man with 4 other comorbidities died of COVID. That's terrible. A 28-year-old whose gym was shut down, whose livelihood went away, who fell into a deep depression and then took accidentally a fentanyl overdose and they died. We ignore that. This is terrible, but that's not even, doesn't even impact us.
Yes, it will have no impact. Exactly because when all this anxiety and all this frustration and all this aggression connects to this narrative that indicates an object of anxiety, all the psychological energy is connected to this narrative. And what is not in the narrative is not connected to psychological energy. And that's exactly why what is the things that are not indicated by the narrative have no impact. They have no emotional or cognitive impact. They exist. People hear that there is collateral damage, but it will have no impact. Now, that's you can understand that perfectly from a psychological perspective. And it has also like there is a second problem. The process of mass formation, crowd formation, is similar, if not identical, to the process of hypnosis. And it also makes that people who are grasped in the process of mass formation are not aware of the egoistic disadvantages they suffer. So when someone is in mass formation, you can take everything away from this person, even his own life. He will not notice it. You can take his health away, his wealth away. You can take everything away. He might lose his future and his freedom. He will not be aware that he loses it. That's one of them. And you see exactly the same in hypnosis. The attention is so much focused on one point through a simple hypnotic procedure that you can cut straight through people's flesh and bones, literally. With a simple hypnotic procedure, you can make someone radically insensitive to pain to this extent that you can perform a surgical operation on that person, that you can cut straight through the breastbone. The person will not notice it. That shows the power of hypnotic procedures and also of mass formation. And that was so striking from a historical point of view. When historians saw what was happening in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, they felt like they had never seen something like that before, because a totalitarian state and totalitarianism is something completely different from a classical dictatorship. It's something completely different. In a classical dictatorship, people are scared of the dictator because of his physical power. But in a totalitarian regime, everything starts with this process of mass formation. It grasps people in the core of their being. It brings them under a kind of hypnosis, and that makes that the totalitarian state has an extreme power over individuals, also over their private life and over their cognitive and mental functioning, it's completely different from a classical dictatorship. And it's exactly because it is based on this process of mass formation or mass hypnosis.
I want to explore this. So the relationship, hypnosis and mass formation, hypnosis at the individual level, mass formation operating at the collective level across a culture. How many people are susceptible to hypnosis? Not everybody is.
A lot are.
A lot are, okay.
Usually I think about 80% of the people. It depends a little bit. The extent of the depth of the hypnosis will not be the same for everyone. But in mass formation, usually only about 30% of the people is really into the process of mass formation, not much more.
Okay, and for that 30%, is there any relationship between intelligence and susceptibility to that?
Not at all. Not at all.
Really?
No. And that's a strange thing. That's one of the major characteristics of a crowd or a mass, that everybody becomes as intelligent, or maybe better, as stupid. but they are not, and that applies to highly intelligent people equally well as to less intelligent people. That has been studied in the 19th century already, very extensively. It was very clear that even the most intelligent people were completely blind and completely insensitive to rational argumentation, for instance. Masses are only sensitive to strong visual images and to repetition of time and time again the same message, and also to the presentation of numbers and graphs and statistics. If you present numbers and statistics in a visual way, they will have a huge impact on the masses.
Now, this is really near and dear to my heart because part of my work is I work with a lot of doctors who figured out early treatments, and they're very flexible and creative, and they've just been shut down and squashed. I know people who consider themselves really intelligent, really successful individuals, also doctors who still to this day in this country, if you get COVID, you might end up in a hospital on remdesivir and a ventilator, even though we've known for 18 months that's a death sentence and it's not state of the art. And I know people who will vigorously defend that that's the right thing to do because they're a doctor and they're all wrapped up in it. I don't know how do you mentally come back from that, knowing that you've been a German in 1933, or you've been a Jacobin at the Bridget Nantes, drowning people in the French Revolution, or once you've gone there, how do you get back?
That's a very good question. So it's extremely hard to undo a process of mass formation. That's very clear. For instance, it's extremely hard to wake someone up who is in a process of mass formation. But Gustave Le Bon, I don't know if you're familiar with Gustave Le Bon, he wrote a very important book on mass formation in the 19th century, The Psychology of the Crowds, it was called. And he describes already there that if the people who are not in the mass formation try to wake up the people who are in a mass formation, then they will be confronted probably with failure. They will be confronted with the fact that they are unable to wake up the masses. But he says, nevertheless, it is extremely important to continue to speak out, because if people continue to speak out, the hypnosis might become less deep, and it will become less deep. Gustave Le Bon presents several historical examples of situations in which people who were awake continued to speak out and prevented the masses from committing atrocities, because that's typically what masses do. Because one function of the mass formation is the satisfaction of all this frustration and aggression, the fourth condition. Masses typically have the inclination to show the tendency to commit atrocities, and they typically do it being convinced that they perform an almost sacred pledge, and that they do something that is really their duty, and that has to do with the fact that people in mass formation are convinced that what they do is for the greater good, for the well-being of the collective. But they forget, of course, that it is for the well-being of a certain collective and at the disadvantage of another part of the population. But anyway, so it's hard to wake the masses up. The only thing, but if you continue to speak, the 30% of the population who is really into the process of mass formation, you will make the hypnosis less deep in this part of the population, and you might prevent the masses from committing atrocities. So it's extremely important to continue to speak out. That's the most important thing, I think.
I want to ask a question about the how, about going about speaking out, because if I heard how we got into this, there was repetition, there was ritual, there was that hypnotic sort of getting people in. So we know how hypnotists wake people back up again, right? So they bring them back out into their larger, out of the narrow focus, out again. To me, and by the way, this is my entire work in the world now, is trying to help wake us up in time to prevent those atrocities from getting worse than they've already been. So an idea I have is to use repetition. And here's my highest thing. If we can just back it up a bit, we can say, listen, I'm no public health expert, but if I was one, my highest goal would be reducing mortality. Like my efforts either made things worse or made things better. I don't have to get involved with whether the vaccines work or people died with COVID or of COVID. Let's just back up. And I can tell you that right now in the United States, all-cause mortality is running way above even last year, and it's way above where it should be. So I can say, hey, I think we're failing at this and we should do better. That's an open question, just put it out there. But if we had multiple people actually pushing on that, like different, I know lots of other thought leaders and people who have big platforms and large followings. So if we all started saying that same thing, I'm just wondering if messaging, would that be effective? If we started pushing on one scratchy sort of a unanswerable question?
Yes, that will be effective to a certain extent. I believe so. Yes, definitely.
Okay, fantastic.
But we should not immediately expect a very large effect. I think we'll be able to wake up someone here and there, but not the large portions of the population, I think. But it's extremely important. That's exactly how we have to do it, I think. Just try to talk in an as sincere and honest way. Try to continue to speak out. Try to continue to make sure that there is a dissonant voice in the public space. That's extremely important, because if you look historically, for instance, you can see that it was exactly at the moment that the opposition was silenced in public space, that there was no dissonant voice anymore in public space, that the totalitarian states started to commit their absurd atrocities. That happened in 1930 in the Soviet Union, and around 1935 in Nazi Germany. At that moment, the opposition was completely silenced, was completely erased in public space. And at that moment, the system really turned absurd. For instance, Stalin in the Soviet Union, he started to kill no matter who. In the end, he killed 50% of his own party members who usually hadn't done anything wrong. So, and that's something typical. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher who wrote this wonderful book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She says that at the moment, the opposition is radically silenced in public space. At that moment, the totalitarian state becomes a monster that devours its own children. That's exactly what she says. The totalitarian system becomes a monster that devours its own children at that exact moment. So that shows us again that something radically different from a classical dictatorship. When a classical dictator manages to silence the opposition, he usually will become more friendly, because this guy, a classical dictator, has a certain tactical awareness. He knows that at the moment he is in charge, and at the moment he really overcame all opposition. He knows that at that moment it's important for him to show the population that he will be a good leader. That's what he realizes. But in a totalitarian state, which is based on this process of sleep and hypnosis, totalitarian leaders are not aware or do not have the brains at that moment to just know that it will be to their own disadvantage if they continue to commit atrocities. But that's exactly what they do. It even gets much worse once they really have or the only voice in public space. So it's so important to understand that difference between classical dictatorships and totalitarian processes. For instance, also, totalitarian leaders typically are also hypnotized by their own voice and their own theory. They are hypnotized, Gustave Le Bon says that, Hannah Arendt says it as well. They are hypnotized by their own ideology, meaning that they do not believe what they tell the people, but they are so convinced that what they are trying to do in society, that the ideology that they are trying to impose to society will bring society to a kind of paradise. They are so convinced that what they are doing is the good thing, that they feel that it is justified to lie, to cheat, to manipulate, and so on. That's typically, but they are absolutely ideologically hypnotized. They are hypnotized by their ideology. That's something that is radically different also from classical dictatorships. And
if I could, so much to the chagrin of I think many in the profession, we saw that psychologists worked on nudge units in the UK and in Australia and probably New Zealand, probably the US, but these were psychologists who said, hey, government, we're going to help you dial up the fear so that you can get people to do the things you want them to do. And of course, the government is believing, I think you're right, it feels right to me, that the government, the officials in this, they believe this is the right thing to do. They know that. We know they're using actual techniques that have been honed and developed. I mean, you read the 1928 book by Bernays, it's already a fairly comprehensive superstructure of how you go about doing this. I'm sure as inelegant as phones were in 1928 compared to today, I'm going to bet the technology, the understanding, the neuro-linguistic mapping, the psychological processes, I bet we understand those better. So this feels a little bit like there is an agenda, but I got to be honest, it's actually only really being run in the Western countries at the level I see it being run. So that's the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and Europe. I don't see India struggling with this at this point in time. Would you agree, or does this feel like it's kind of localized to Western societies at this point?
Maybe. I think what happens now is that many of our leaders are convinced that we need to move from a democratic system to a technocratic system. I think that most of the people are convinced that this is the only solution for the unsolvable problems we are facing now. And I think at that level, they really believe that they do the right thing. So I think they are convinced that if we want to deal with climate change, with the corona, with the pandemics, with all kinds of other problems, we need to move from a democratic to a technocratic system. And that's why I think that many of them are so convinced that they indeed feel that it is justified to use psychological techniques such as nudging and so on, to make people believe in the narrative and to convince them to go along with the narrative, to buy into the narrative. I think that's what happens. I think we have to distinguish between the level of ideology and the level of the narratives that are distributed in society. I think that our leaders believe that at the ideological level, they do the right thing. They even choose for the only possible solution. And I think that many of them will not really believe in the narratives they are distributing. I think that many of them will consider the narratives as a kind of an instrument to make the ideology happen. So I think that's about what happens. I don't think I think something like that happens.
Okay, this is absolutely brilliant. So I think we're at the heart of this now for me and my understanding, where I'm at in the development of understanding this. So what I'd like to do is try and understand it from their perspective. So they sleep at night, they believe they're doing a higher order good. Maybe there's some self-interest and some power and some usual ego and greed and stuff like that wrapped in. Always is. Hey, we're humans, but they believe on some level in this larger story, which if I listen to the Davos crowd, they tell me specifically that they're very concerned about something that I think is real, which is that by 2050, we'll need 3 planets of resources and we only have 1, right? And there's an issue there. We know that we're at this really unusual part of our species development where we've kind of grown into the edge of our petri dish. And now we got to, go to a plan B. Their plan B, though, is technological nirvana, this technocracy. So I can only imagine, like Fauci, I can get my head around Fauci. He seems really committed to the idea that everybody needs to be on this vaccine program and that's the only way, like to the exclusion of every other possible measure. It's all about getting everybody, right down to infants, on a vaccine program. So if I put myself in his head, he must believe, at least on some level, leaving aside money and power, that is a right thing to do. That brings us somewhere we should go.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's dangerous, of course. It's not because people believe that they are doing the good thing that they are not dangerous.
No. It lacks all humility, which is that, guess what? These are complex systems. They have emergent behaviors. We can't predict what's going to happen.
Exactly.
But I think they can control everything, everything, and get a predicted outcome at the back end of that.
Of course. Yes. Well, from a science point of view, this idea of being able to control everything is absurd. As you referred to complex dynamical systems, to the emergence of complex dynamical systems, we all know that complex dynamical systems are unpredictable in the chaotic phase. They have this characteristic of deterministic unpredictability. Edward Lawrence wrote this wonderful paper on deterministic unpredictability of complex systems. They should read it all, and then they should realize that they started something that will lead up to only one thing. to self-destruction. And that's exactly what people like Le Bon and Arendt already described, that totalitarianism always destroys itself, always. And then, because it's so important to realize, because the people who do not buy into the narrative, who do not go along with the narrative, and who wonder what they can do, we just gave them the advice that they have to try to continue to speak out. That's one important advice. But the second one is that the best strategy always is non-violent resistance. Always. That's the best strategy, because every kind of violence used against the system will be used as a justification for the aggression and the frustration, to channel the aggression and the frustration to that group. That's one thing. And the second thing is that the group who doesn't buy into the narrative does not have to destroy the system. The system always destroys itself. Always. It's intrinsically self-destructive. But it can take a while, of course. And then that's why it's very often necessary to establish a kind of parallel structures that allow people to survive more or less, or a little bit independent from the system. Well, yes, I agree completely with that people can think they can control processes as the ones that are happening now, but they can't. Definitely not. Science shows this in the most clear-cut way.
Yep, it's an absolute guarantee. I love this idea of parallel structures, and that's what I do with my tribe, as I call us. We are practicing with those parallel structures, but to me, the steps are: one, you have to be aware that this is happening, because that's my first line of defense. So when I read nudging articles, right? So here's one from the Omicron variant, just came out a few days ago, and I'm looking here at a PBS article. It reads, first sentence: worried scientists in South Africa are scrambling to combat the lightning spread across the country of a new and highly transmissible Omicron variant as the world grapples. Those are all leading terms to me. Those are all emotionally charged, and they're like you say, they're ungrounded. It's just sort of free floating. Look at all that anxiety. Lightning speed, blitzkrieg, fire is scrambling, and it's just, and it turns out I called up some doctors in South Africa and I said, what are you dealing with? And they're like, it seems mild. It's like I can perform better journalism than these people, but they're caught. Whoever wrote this is caught. Nobody had to teach this person to write it that way, did they? No, they just knew, right?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So step one is, if I can see that happening, I can be immune from it. And then step two is, I think we got to find each other and come together, so we're not tons of little voices. Yeah.
Connect. Because that's mass formation emerges in a disconnected society. So people have to be socially atomized, Hannah Arendt called it. So they have to be socially isolated. There has to be a lack of social bond. But once mass formation is established, and once a totalitarian thinking emerges in a society, it makes the social isolation even much worse. That's very typical. In a totalitarian state, Arendt says there is only one bond that is allowed, and there's the bond between the state and the individual, but not between the individuals. So totalitarianism typically destroys all the social bonds between individuals. And that's why we have to try to do the opposite. We have to try to connect with each other, to try to connect as much as possible differently. So speak out and connect with each other. That are two very important, two extremely important things. Yes.
Yeah. So it will pass on its own, though. I think Charles Mackay, to paraphrase badly out of memory, said that it has been seen that men think in herds and they go mad in herds, but they will recover their senses only slowly and one by one. Something like that, right? So
something like that.
You can feel this mass psychosis. As we come into the last part of this, I'm curious, because a lot of this feels intentional to me. Your estimation is, how much of this looks intentional versus this is just how it goes?
It's a mixture between the two. I think, as always. And I think people typically have the inclination to overestimate the intentional part, but that doesn't mean, of course, that there is no intentional part. I agree with you, and I also believe that many experts and leaders now know that the vaccination strategy actually doesn't really work, or that at least it didn't bring us what we could expect. Many experts know that face mask wearing actually doesn't lead to less contamination. So, for instance, and sometimes the experts also tell this in the mainstream media. I remember one virologist here in Belgium saying that the mask wearing is a symbolic measure because it remembers people every day that there is a pandemic and that they should go along with the measures, or that they should stick to the measures. So I think people know it indeed, but I think that again, I think what these people still believe that maybe this vaccine doesn't work, but in the end, it will be the best for everyone if people get vaccinated 3 times a year. So this ideological fiction, this belief that we should replace nature through an artificial system, natural immunity through an artificial system. This is so typical for totalitarianism. This was typically, maybe people are not aware of that, I think, but that is what totalitarianism is. Totalitarianism always tries to establish an artificial world and an artificial society which can be entirely rationally controlled and manipulated. That is the ultimate goal of a certain mechanistic ideology, which is also the basis of totalitarianism. So that I do believe that the experts know that many of the measures and stuff don't really work, but I think they are still convinced that their system and their ideological approach of society will be the best ever. I think, and in the end, it becomes entirely absurd, of course, because in the end, they are willing to sacrifice 50% of humanity or even 100%. To make their ideological fiction real, and that's the absurdness of this kind of thinking. Yes.
Yeah. Well, the COVID measures don't work from a public health standpoint. That's clear. And as they say in the military, once is an accident, twice is coincidence, but 3 times is enemy action. But if you dare point out that's the case, you'll find yourself censored, marginalized, maybe lose a job. This happens a lot. So there is a high cost to speaking up.
Oh yes, of course. Yes.
Yes. Do we just have to bear that cost because that's the times we live in, or is there a way to split the difference? Or because I know a lot of people losing jobs out of all of this.
Yes,
as they speak up.
You know, the ancient Greeks knew already that speaking the truth is always dangerous, because you can define truth as that part of knowledge that is in conflict with public discourse. The ancient Greeks considered it like that. As soon as a narrative is dominant in public space, you will start to feel that the narrative is incomplete, and that in one way or another, someone should say in public space that there is a problem with dominant narrative. And the ancient Greeks knew that the one who tells it, the one who tries to say what everybody feels, but that nobody dares to say, that person is in danger. So, and that's what the ancient Greeks considered speaking the truth. And it means, they called it pareisia. So a kind of speech which consists of just telling that something that everybody feels that it should be told, but that nobody dares to say. And if you do that, you're in danger. That's true. And I think we should continue to try to do it, because the better you understand what is happening, the more you see that actually there is no other option. There is no other option. If we shut up, we will be in danger as well. People who now go along with the narrative, do not realize by the danger they expose themselves to. They have no idea what's awaiting them. And
could we even say that as expensive as it is now to speak up, it'll be more expensive if you wait?
Definitely. Yes. That's one more thing. And of course, I think we have to be careful and we have to be as polite and as friendly as possible. And I think we do not only have to speak for ourselves, we also have to speak for the people who believe in the narrative, because in the end, it will be clear that they need a dissonant voice. And that without this dissonant voice, the system will close and will become radically self-destructive. And I think maybe we can also learn something from them at certain points. But we have to try to establish an open conversation as much as possible in society. And we have to do that for everyone, not only for ourselves, but also for the people who are into the mass or the mass phenomenon. Because in the end, they are human beings as well. Yeah. And
so with compassion, I'm often saying that for the people who've gone off that into the mass psychosis, not if, but when they come back, I'll welcome them. There's not going to be big, ugly lessons learned, rubbing their noses in it kind of thing. Like, listen, can we just, everybody has to be welcomed back into reality, as I call it at this point. So the reality, yes. We face huge predicaments. A problem has a solution. A predicament, just, you have to manage the outcome. We're facing huge predicaments economically, ecologically. We've got energy issues, like big things that we really need our best minds on. And we need we have to have the ability to have uncomfortable conversations, right? It's like, and if we can't even do that around something as simple as should people take vitamin D or not, without that somehow becoming, against the state narrative, I think we're in trouble. So I really think this is important. To me, tell me if you disagree, but what's at stake is literally everything. Yes. I like living in an abundant, well-functioning society. I think that could all break if we mismanage this to the point that our currency collapses because we didn't figure out how to close the gap between the debts we have and the liabilities we have in reality. If we don't do that on our own terms, it'll come on nature's terms. And I don't like that. I'd rather do this consciously and elegantly. So I think that's what's at risk. To me, everything.
Yes, I agree. Yes, definitely. And that's exactly the ultimately mass formation always destroys the core of the human being. It destroys the humanity in the human being. And so we are human, I think, as long as we try to speak to each other.
Yeah.
And when that's the use of language and the establishing a social bond through speech is what characterizes a human being and what makes it different from other living beings. And I think that's what we have to try to represent. We have to try to represent humanity in this crisis and to try to prevent that humanity disappears. And we have to do it just by trying to continue to speak, to be respectful to the other people, to give them the right to have their own opinion, to even give them the right to be in a mass phenomenon, to be in a mass formation, but by just telling them, we will try to continue to speak to you, and we will try to continue that there are people who think differently, that there are people who look at it from a different perspective. We have to be as sensitive as possible, as honest as possible, as sincere as possible, but that's the only solution, I think, or that's the only way to prevent the system, to close and to destroy everything. Which I don't believe it will. I'm really optimistic in this sense. I believe that there will be a group of people who manage to continue to speak out and who will bring change in this situation. But I'm not naive in this respect that the next years will be very tough years, I think. But well, we know what to do, I think.
Yeah. This is the good that's come out of COVID for me is I've found people like yourself, like the Pierre Corey, like all the doctors out there who are really speaking that truth to power, even though it costs So we find who has integrity, we find who has moral courage, we find who's intellectually honest in this story, and that's wonderful. That's very good because we need to find each other as a first step. Yes, and this is when a great reshaping. I think good things, we can come out of this better. The fact that 11 million people in Belgium are consuming 300 million doses of antidepressants in a year tells us there are things we can improve upon.
Yeah.
So that's the hope I have, and the opportunity in the story is that we can do better. I think we can.
Yes, indeed. And that is the real problem. The real problem is not the virus. Maybe the virus is also a problem. And definitely, if you die of the virus, it must be terrible and so on. It's not about that. But the real problem we try to find a solution for, without knowing it, is this psychological discontent and this psychological misery the society was in before the crisis. And the crisis and this narrative on the coronavirus was a symptom of the real problem, which was actually the psychological state of the population, which in its turn was connected to our view on man and the world, our mechanistic view on man and the world, our materialist view on man and the world. That's the real problem. A view on man and the world that actually is not scientific at all. Because if you look at the science of the last 150 years, it exactly showed us that we are not a biological machine and that the universe is not a mechanical system. Far from that. It's a system that is aware, that is conscious, a system that reacts to our consciousness. Mm-hmm. That's the real revolution, I think, that has to happen, that the old view on man and the world is replaced by a view that is different, and that
This is where I've come to as well, as this idea that that these might well be birthing pains, but this is the moment where humanity, our consciousness, gets to come forward and understand that consciousness consciously interacts with itself and what this stuff we call matter and reality. It's a huge awakening. And
for instance,
and nature's been running this experiment for a while. So either we step up to the plate and into our full potential, or we don't. But that's literally what's at stake here. Is probably the most worthy thing of all, is to be a participant in a really incredible moment of evolution. And so maybe a lot of this is just how it goes, right? Getting born is never easy.
Exactly. And that's also why, personally, I don't think that ultimately what we are dealing with is a conspiracy. It's an ideological problem. That's what I believe ultimately. Of course, people conspire from time to time and so on, but ultimately we are dealing with a problem at the level we are dealing with an ideological problem, I think. People are grasped in a certain ideology, a certain view on man and the world. And it is this view on man and the world that is the real problem in this situation. That's what I believe.
I believe so too. So the framing then becomes that those who want to give us this technocratic future they envision, to them, the dichotomy is they say it's this future progression. This is where we were always going. But in fact, they're trying to hold us back into a very old ideology, which is not the one we need. So that's the fundamental tension in that story, is that it's inaccurate.
Indeed.
They're promising us everything while delivering us the past. It doesn't work. Fantastic. So how do I help you? How does my tribe help you? What do you tell me about this book you're writing? And I know people are going to want to follow you more closely after this and find out what you're saying and thinking. So how do we do that?
You helped me already now by just giving me the opportunity to speak and to bring my story here, or my view on this problem. So that's one very important thing, I think. And if you want, you can invite me another time when I finish the book. It's finished.
Done.
It's finished. It will be published in January. It is finished now, but it still has to be translated in English because I wrote it in Dutch.
Yep. And what's the title?
The Psychology of Totalitarianism.
Beautiful. That's
Oh.
going to be, yep. We'll have you right back on because I'll have a lot of people interested
Wonderful.
in that on my end.
No.
Absolutely. Well, Doctor, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your work in the world. And this has been a fabulous conversation, and I really do plan to have follow up with you very soon.
And thank you very much for inviting me and for listening.